The next session, a conversation with Pete Buttigieg, is sponsored by the Kresge Foundation. Please welcome former U.S. Secretary of Transportation, Pete Buttigieg, and President and Chief Executive Officer of the Detroit Regional Chamber, Sandy Barua.
Go. Yep. All right, good afternoon. Thank you. Okay, you brought your own cheering squad. I love speakers who come prepared. That's awesome. Well, Pete, and by the way, I know I can call him Pete, so no Twitter complaints that I'm calling a cabinet secretary by his first name.
So we're all Midwesterners here, right?
So, Pete, welcome back to the Mackinac Policy Conference and the island. We had the pleasure of hosting you a couple years ago when you were still in the role as a cabinet secretary for President Biden. We were honored to have you then, honored to have you now. So you're a Michiganian. You, your husband, and your two beautiful children. Have you had a chance, as the four of you, to kind of just hang out here at the island without having to, put on a suit and get mic'd up and talk to television?
Yeah, we did. It was great. A couple summers ago, Chasten said we ought to go up there. Of course, that was on our dime, so we weren't as grand as this. I think we were at the Best Western in St. Ignace, which is also lovely, but made it more of a day trip. But it was great. The kids loved it. There was the butterfly house, which they liked. Obviously, horses, big hit with the 3-year-old crowd. And I'll always remember it as the beginning of our early potty training days with the pull-ups, because there's a little kind of
Well, there's a lot of that on the streets anyway.
That's
so maybe
true,
it's not a bad place to be for that.
I just remember there was a little outhouse or bathroom like opposite that nice park with the big green slope.
Yeah.
And I swear we went in there 15 times in like a 3-hour period. So it was the launch. I'm proud to report that we're on the other end of that potty training sequence now, and excited to bring them back up.
Well, great. That's awesome. So, listen, I want to dive into issues that really impact the state of Michigan and our nation. Let's start with transportation issues, since obviously you were the U.S. DOT secretary. The Detroit Regional Chamber runs the statewide automotive cluster association. It's called MISHATA. We represent OEMs, Tier 1s, Tier 2s across the state. We are very concerned about Chinese-built, Chinese-owned, Chinese-controlled vehicles running around America because, as Senator Slotkin has coined the phrase, these are essentially rolling intelligence gathering devices. And we've been working with Senator Slotkin, Senator Moreno, and their House counterparts, Molinar and Dingell, on legislation. You were there when this issue was brewing. What is your perspective on the threat of the Chinese auto industry to our industry from both an economic and national security issue?
Yeah, I think you're right to be concerned. I think Senator Slotkin and her colleagues are right to be proactive about this. There's both a national security and an economic security concern, and it is real. Look, as I think we all know, vehicles are becoming more and more of a computer, so to speak, each passing year. And that means the digital security dimension of our vehicles weighs more heavily each passing year. And we know from what has happened in so many other areas of technology what can happen when China is able to exert its influence and leverage its presence in a market for a lot of purposes that are not consistent with American national security. And on the economic security side, we know that the arrival of these vehicles and these technologies is not happening in some kind of textbook competitive market, that there is a massive thumb on the scale that is happening, everything from excess capacity to what's going on with IP, that means that when these vehicles do enter a market, whether it's one of our, the attempt to enter our market or any of the other markets where our OEMs compete, they're not doing it on fair terms. So I think a robust policy response is absolutely needed. Having said that, let me name the other side of the coin, which is that policy alone can't do the work here. Even though these markets are not pure, and not always fair, they are markets. And so it's going to be critically important that our sectors, our industry, our OEMs are competitive and innovative. And I know that the policy uncertainty coming out of Washington is making that only more difficult. And I feel the urgency of that both as a Michigander, and later you can explain to me which percentage of us are supposed to be Michiganian versus Michigander.
The Detroit News and our former governor, Rick Snyder, have been trying to teach me to say Michiganian as opposed to Michigander. And then there's people who are trying to teach me the other way.
Okay. I see we've hit a nerve.
Okay, so
all right.
just don't say anything about MSU or U of M. That'll really set them off.
Okay, well, to come back to much safer territory, like U.S. versus China. But I also say, I'm also a son of South Bend. And, South Bend was a company town for Studebaker. Mm-hmm. Studebaker went out of business in 1963. And its demise was still the dominant fact about the city. 20 years later when I was born, 50 years later when I became mayor. And the main reason Studebaker is not making cars today is they couldn't keep up and innovate. And so I know in a very visceral, physical way, having lived among factory buildings that looked like they'd been destroyed in a war, what happens if any sector of the American economy or any firm within the American economy is unable to remain at the cutting edge? And I hope that a sense of urgency is animating our automotive sector on the actual work that has to be done to claim that cutting edge that China is racing to own as they're deploying these inexpensive and increasingly technologically impressive vehicles that you will see if you go anywhere in Europe, and it sounds like you're going to see more and more often in Canada now as well.
At least 50,000.
Yeah. So, we've got to be, yes, we need to have a strong policy fence here, and we need to support, as we sought to do when I was in the cabinet, support this sector in every way we can. But it is the company's job, the industry's job, to make sure that there is enough advancement and competitiveness and sophistication. If you don't have that, then the policy part is just a finger in the dike.
So I do want to talk about kind of the policy, the Trump administration's policies regarding vehicles and your administration. But before we get there, just one last thing on Chinese vehicles. And let's be clear, we're not just talking about Chinese EVs. Right, we're talking about Chinese vehicles, gas, hybrid, BEVs. What have you seen when the Chinese started to go into other nations? While you were Secretary of Transportation, as you mentioned, into Europe, into parts of Asia. What did you see the impact of Chinese vehicles being sold in those markets?
Well, again, because this is happening with a lot of market manipulation on the Chinese side, what you're seeing is how quickly they can flood many of these markets. And if we want to make sure that we're not just only selling cars to ourselves, and even that is challenging if we're not keeping up, then we do have to recognize just how tilted that proposition is. And you're right, it's EVs, it's more than EVs. And to me, the electrification is the second most important technological development for the automotive sector after automation, which is another area where I know with these robo-taxis, China is working aggressively to try to corner global markets that I'm not even sure we're playing in yet.
So now let's switch to policy, and you mentioned electrification. So as we were chit-chatting backstage, I made the admission that our family are EV converts. We love EVs, but we're not the normal family, and we have more cars than my wife tells me we need, so we have options. They're not for everyone, but we are converts. Now, the Biden administration took, I think, what you could call a supply-side approach with incentives to bolster the burgeoning EV industry for American American manufacturers and American consumers. The Trump administration has taken, let's just call it, a very, very different approach.
That's one way to put it.
The biggest issue from the companies that we represent is not was the Biden administration right or was the Trump administration right. It's the whipsaw of the policy approaches, which is costing our industry billions upon billions of dollars. What if you were there again? What would be the right approach that balances supply side and demand side that still would allow American companies to compete globally in the globally growing EV market?
Yeah, well, again, I think it helps to step back and ask why China moved so swiftly and aggressively to try to obtain technological superiority on EVs. And it is not because the Chinese Communist Party is filled with environmental enthusiasts, right? like this was an economic security strategy on their part. That was the approach we tried to take as well. And it really centered on, from a consumer's perspective, on the fact that EVs are cheaper to fuel, cheaper to own, cheaper to maintain, but more expensive to buy. So the idea of the tax credits was, of course, to buy that down, cultivate, with preference for American-made vehicles, cultivate that American industry until we reach the horizon where they are simply cheaper to make because we're making more of them. And one of the thrilling things for me as secretary, having first gotten into politics as a statewide candidate in Indiana at a time when it was not clear whether the Chrysler facilities in Kokomo would go dark forever, to go back in those facilities and see them working on the hybrid and electric engines there. And having been at the auto show this year, I was taken aback by how the companies have had now to respond to this oscillation in policy. That's incredible. If you're on a 4-year product cycle, and you also have to be looking over your shoulder at a 4-year political cycle that doesn't exactly match up, this is not gonna work in the long run. And what really worries me is that it's not just a withdrawal of support for EVs, which in itself I think is a tragedy, because the support for EVs was saving Americans money and building up an American EV auto industry. But it is frankly actively being a headwind on a lot of greener and cleaner technology too. And I would just ask, has there ever been a time when America got ahead by actively spending money trying to keep older technologies going longer? Yeah. Like, has that ever been our thing? Like, let's just tie ourselves to something old for as long as we possibly can technologically.
Well, there is a movement to bring back 8-track tape players. I just don't, I don't know if that's going to work, but.
I'll tell you, I remember being in Congress testifying on some of this stuff and feeling like I was here to talk about mobile phones and I had somehow arrived at the Rotary Phone Association. That's not going to cut it in the 2020s, definitely not into the 2030s.
Yeah. Electrification is growing globally, except for here.
Yeah, and there's no going back, because it would be one thing if it was an inferior technology. Mm-hmm. And look, let's be honest, there have been times when people have been asked to adopt an inferior technology because it was better environmentally. I'll give you the example of the CFL, the compact fluorescent light bulb, right? There was a time when everybody said, you got to have these CFLs because they consume less energy than the old incandescent light bulb, which was true. It was also true that the light was kind of weird color temperature, it didn't look nice, and they were super toxic if they broke. And there are all kinds of reasons why you were kind of asking somebody to spend more for a worse product because some felt we needed to climate-wise. Then LEDs came out and the whole kind of space moved on. But my point is, this is not that. We're talking about technology that is, in fact, better. The only problem is making it less expensive. I also really worry that Americans underestimate how far behind we might be falling.
Yep. At least 10 years.
I recently heard a news item where a reporter drove an EV in China, into this little, I don't know what to call it, facility, garage slot, and a robot in about 3 minutes, changed its battery.
Yeah, it's probably a Neo.
So it's quicker than filling up, and it drove on.
One of the engineers who worked at Neo and did that is sitting in the audience right now.
Well, that was very impressive. We should be doing that here and not over there.
So just a real quick last comment around China and EVs. You know, with what's going on with the war and the Straits of Hormuz closed, China's strategy to have such a healthy percentage of their cars as EVs has really softened the blow to China in terms of not having the oil come through the Straits, because China is very dependent upon, more dependent on than any other nation.
Yeah, look, I think when we started producing more oil domestically in the last few years, there's a temptation to think that means that we no longer have to worry as much about being dependent on oil because it's not the same thing as being dependent on foreign oil. While that might be true on its face, I think it kind of skips over the simple fact that oil is traded globally, and a barrel of oil that is pumped in the U.S., extracted in the U.S., and used in the U.S. is still more expensive because it's something that's happening in the Middle East, right? And that's why a diversification of our energy, an all-of-the-above strategy where we got more hydro, more nuclear, more solar, which really has become the cheapest form in a lot of contexts, and more wind. I don't know what this president has against wind. The birds are going to be fine. The whales I'm pretty sure they're going to be okay coexisting with wind. But you know, we got to be doing this. And it's been interesting to see the environmental movement, I think, come to accept the role that nuclear needs to play if we are serious about carbon being the form of pollution we most worry about. But we've got to have a better energy picture, or we're still, even in a context where the U.S. is a net exporter of oil, still going to have Americans trying to fill up their tank, trying to farm, trying to get through life, more economically vulnerable because of what's happening in the oil markets and what's happening in places like the Middle East. Now, obviously, I also don't think that this war should be happening in the first place, like most Americans. But whether or not we start one, it's a reasonably good bet that there will often be conflict and instability in that region. One of many, 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 many reasons why we should be moving forward, not back, on our transportation technology.
Yeah, well, fair enough. Yeah, absolutely. So, Pete, turning from the ground to the air, air travel obviously is the safest form of transportation. You're at far more risk in your car driving to the airport than you are once you board that 757.
Yep.
But there's been a lot of high-profile close calls, actual incidents. We just had one 10 days ago.
Yep.
That was tragic. Why is it that we seem to be seeing more of these commercial air travel incidences that gives the patina of being less safe?
Yeah. Well, I do think it's worth first dwelling on how much safer aviation is, even now, with some of the incidents that have happened. Let's just be clear how astonishing it is that this form of transportation, which, let's remind ourselves, involves getting into a metal tube and being propelled by flammable liquids miles above the surface of the ground, is by far...
So your next job will not be the head of the Air Transport Association. You're doing a terrible job selling this.
Well, here comes the but. It is by far the safest way to get away. Just in the time I was secretary, we had 4 billion passenger enplanements. 4 billion times somebody got on an airliner. Out of those 4 billion, the number of crash fatalities on airliners, commercial airliners, was 0. There are very few things you can do in this life and have a 0 out of 4 billion fatality rate. Certainly transportation. Any form of transportation you can think of, from your own 2 feet to the space shuttle to one of these beautiful Mackinac horses, a 0 out of 4 billion fatality rate is almost impossible. So that is a huge civilizational achievement. Now, the question becomes, okay, what does it take to keep it that way? And the reality is we have a lot of systems that are bolted on. They've been around for a very long time. There's been a reluctance or a challenge in changing them. For example, I remember touring air traffic control facilities as secretary. I remember seeing one computer that was running on DOS. younger staff, interns here, well, afterwards we'll explain what that means. It took 3.5-inch floppy disks. I remember asking, if one of these floppy disk breaks, where would you even get it? Does Staples even have these? How are we doing this?
And vacuum tubes. Don't forget vacuum tubes.
I hope there weren't any vacuum tubes in there, but like that was what it started to feel like. And again, we're talking about a system that was kind of pieced together over time and that did deliver and has delivered remarkable results, but that system is showing its age. Now, one of the biggest problems we have is our funding process. And I say funding process because it's actually not the same thing as funding levels. Funding levels for the FAA have been pretty healthy. We made a major request. We couldn't get Congress to pass any budget at all, but my successor, one of the areas, despite my differences with my successor, one of the areas I've been rooting for him on is to continue the work of the modernization. But it, until recently, has been subject to annual appropriations. I don't want to get deep into the technicalities of the budget process, but I would just ask anyone running a private sector organization, as many of you are, I would ask you, can you imagine what it would be like to do a multi-billion-dollar IT overhaul for your organization and not know from one year to the next year what the budget was going to be, what the funding was going to be? You wouldn't do any major capital plan that way. And yet that's how Congress required the FAA to do this. And that is part of the reason why planning broke down among very, very intelligent people on a project called, delivering, for example, on a project called Next Gen, as in next generation, which was being talked about when I became secretary, but was launched in 2003, which meant that it was last gen by the time I got to Washington. So we need to make sure that we upgrade the systems. There's work underway on that, but it's got a long way to go. And when you strip the politics out of, there's been finger pointing, but the reality is, like, I'm sure my predecessor cared about this. I believe my successor cares about this. We worked hard to move the ball on that too. Another thing is the people. So I made sure that we had a growing rather than shrinking air traffic control workforce, just the number of people in air traffic control, because they're really overworked. And it's going to be really important to keep that up. And it's not clear yet whether that's continued, but that's what we sought to do on my watch. And then the other thing is regulation. It's easy to grumble about regulation, but obviously that's part of why. There's an extreme attention to detail in the way we regulate our aviation sector. My favorite example of this is that if you're on an airline flight, you may have noticed on some models of aircraft, there's a little thing, a little thumb tab that holds the tray table up in front of you, right? On some models, there's a little notch in it. And the reason the notch is there is that you can hang a jacket on that tab. If I see a couple faces like, oh, that's what that's for. On many aircraft models, if you were in the exit row, the notch is missing because a jacket or an object hanging on a thing in the exit row could add 0.2 seconds per passenger to an evacuation. It's a safety issue. That's the level of attention that goes into this. The really strange thing is we're up in arms, rightly so, anytime there's a problem in our aviation system. You'll remember the plug door that blew out of the Alaska Airlines flight when I was secretary, and we reconsidered our entire approach to Boeing because somebody could have gotten hurt. Meanwhile, enough people to fill a 737 died yesterday on America's roads. And that's going to happen today, and it's going to happen tomorrow. And we barely even talk about it, which is the other reason I believe, as exciting and important as electrification is, the most important thing happening in the sector, the automotive sector, is automation because of the safety potential. And I think we'll be having a lot of conversations in the coming years if these automated vehicles maintain the safety record that they have so far produced in the places they're being tested, like San Francisco, that we will start asking ourselves if we don't have a moral obligation to accelerate the deployment of these things. Something else I think that Detroit needs to get ready for.
Absolutely. In fact, I encourage anyone who's never ridden, like, say, a Waymo in Austin or San Francisco, once you do it, my wife's sitting right here. I'm going to tell just a very quick story. So last summer, we were out in the Bay Area. We try to go at least annually. We did our first Waymo ride as a couple. And, we're, taking pictures and we're, it's like, wow, isn't this cool? And, we're just marveling at how it drives like a normal person because sometimes it, acts like a jerk, right? Like, like I'm going to go in this lane, but I know I'm going to have to go over and cut you off. And it's like, oh, good for you. That's what a normal person would do. but by the second ride, Lisa's on the phone, right? She's just like, yeah, it's so boring. Yeah. Because it's so well done. So let's do quickly, I want to talk about the other part of air transport, and that is competition. So there were issues that confronted you as Secretary, issues that are confronting Secretary Duffy right now around mergers in the airline industry. What's your view on, American and United, of all people, were recently flirting with a merger. Yeah. Does that help consumers? Does that make the system stronger?
No, it does not.
Okay. What do you think?
Look, at the time of deregulation in the 1980s, when the current system was set up, it was confidently predicted that there would be dozens of major airlines in the US, maybe 100. That's what people really thought. And part of the thought was, if you're running an airline, your biggest asset isn't these like big immovable factories, plants and things. It's airplanes, which are actually pretty easy to change hands. And so there's the thought that maybe there wasn't a big barrier to entry, and it would actually function as a very competitive marketplace. It turns out there are lots of reasons why it is anything but a normal economics textbook competitive marketplace. The role of these fortress hubs, the way that, if you, when you really feel it is if you ever try to fly on American Airlines in Detroit or Delta at O'Hare. Right? Mm-hmm. You begin to realize just how dominant the dominant airline is in its particular.
You're at the kiddie terminal.
Totally, yeah. And we've seen this consolidation where, there is a risk that we will at some point be down to Coke and Pepsi, basically. And that is very problematic in terms of innovation, in terms of price competition. It is true that prices have come down over the years. It's also true that they have come down almost exactly at the same rate that aircraft have become more fuel efficient. Probably because, fuel is the most expensive thing, it turns out, in the airline sector. So when I was in office, we tried not to be dogmatic about that. We weren't always against any kind of combination. For example, we allowed Alaska and Hawaiian to merge, but only after they proved that they were going to do it in a way that benefited consumers. We, on the other hand, were against a proposed merger between JetBlue and Spirit. Some people say that if that had happened, Spirit might have lasted longer. It's also possible that if that had happened, we would have lost 2 airlines instead of 1 this year. No one will know for sure. What I do know is that what finally put Spirit Airlines out of business was the Iran war. And what I also know is that we need more, not fewer, airlines in this country.
Okay. Last transportation question, then we're going to move on. There's this thing called the Gordie Howe International Crossing that this organization fought for alongside Governor Snyder for a long time. It's finally built. President Trump is preventing it from opening. What is the impact of that, and is there any rationale for not opening this?
No, there is not. Open the bridge. And I actually think it's really important to connect the dots here, and I do not intend this as a partisan statement. But corruption isn't just bad because it's morally bad. It's bad because it winds up making us all worse off. Let's be super clear about what happened. There's already a bridge. There's the old bridge. Someone makes a lot of money of that old bridge being the only bridge. That person put $1 million into a pro-Trump super PAC and got a hold of Howard Lutnick, the Commerce Secretary. And I don't know what else happened. Maybe something went into the ballroom. Maybe something went into crypto. I don't know. But I know at least the fact pattern that I just described. And sure enough, the President of the United States is suddenly blocking a piece of infrastructure that is economically important to the country, to the state and to the region. It is as simple as that. It is corruption. And I would expect and hope every Republican and every Democrat in this state and in this region will be equally full-throated about demanding that that corrupt reason be dismantled and that that bridge be opened. The craziest thing about this is that Mexico was never going to pay for the wall, but Canada actually paid for the bridge. They paid for it. I remember being briefed on this when I was in transition getting ready to become secretary. They tell you all the biggest things, the gnarliest problems, and the major projects, and the things you're going to have to worry about or talk about in front of Congress. And then they mentioned this bridge. I was like, oh, well, how are we going to put the funding together for this? And like, oh, no, it's all funded. Like, well, what do I have to do? It's like, basically nothing. They're getting it done.
Show up to the opening.
Yeah, which I was really hoping would happen on my watch. It's almost hard to comment on because it is so blindingly obvious. The bridge should be opened, and there should be nothing political about it.
Awesome. Love that answer. So the theme of this conference is the quest for common ground. And we're using this theme in a highly, highly polarized environment. You've been Mayor Pete, you've been Secretary Pete, you've been National Security Pete, your service in our armed forces, you're now Citizen Pete. What is the elixir? Well, first of all, let me ask you, how do you approach the idea of common ground? I mean, you're so well known for being so well reasoned, frankly, so well informed in all things public life. And of course, your demeanor, as we all know, is very, for the lack of a better phrase, balanced. But how do you find in your conversations as you travel the country, how do you find common ground when you're dealing with so many different types of audiences on the left and the right?
Well, first of all, I think it's important just to cultivate the practice of being around people who have different values and different politics. It sounds like a very simple thing. For those of us who live in more purple territory, I think that happens organically. But as our lives move more online, that becomes a smaller share of our presence. It's one of the reasons why I actually really admire this convening, because this is something that's all too rare, which is a gathering of people who have very different political persuasions, but kind of a common fate as much as we're tied together economically. And from what I can tell at the restaurant and at the bar, actually like each other, right? And there are fewer and fewer environments like that. I seek them out. The United States Conference of Mayors is actually another example of that. Maybe the only place you find that many elected officials from both parties who get together, who have a lot of shared priorities and who like each other. So first, just that 3D in-person convening that used to be the most natural thing in the world, I think it's really important to lean into that. And I don't just mean a great conference at the Grand Hotel, but I mean cultivating those spaces from little leagues to public libraries to neighborhoods and everything else where people, by the way, one of the best things about serving in the military was that it was this kind of space. If somebody's getting in my vehicle to go outside the wire in Afghanistan, they did not care if I was a Democrat or a Republican, right? They did not care if I was going home to a girlfriend or a boyfriend. All they want to know is whether I was going to be good at my job. That's what I expected of them. And on the strength of a handshake and a salute, we were trusting ourselves with our lives within a minute or two of meeting each other sometimes. And we have got to find, it doesn't have to be as dramatic as being in a war zone, but we've got to find and cultivate those environments where we build those habits of citizenship and working together. I also think precisely because of what's happening in our media environment and our online lives, we need to kind of penetrate the walls between these silos or these realms where everything is just kind of echoing and self-reinforcing. Think about what your feed, if you get information from a feed, like an Instagram feed, when it comes to politics, think about what it's full of. I mean, usually two things. Here's this person I already like, looking good. Here's this person I already don't like, doing something that reminds me why I don't like them and makes me not like them even more, right? Kind of the opposite of if you're just in a room with somebody you disagree with and you're in touch with that shared humanity, In fact, whenever I'm getting ready to go on Fox, which is my unexpected specialty, not something I thought I'd do, I'm always imagining the viewer as somebody who I knew growing up in Indiana and disagreed with and actually like, and try to have that in the back of my head as a kind of check on the tone. Because of course I get fired up too about a lot of these issues. I'm not without passion, but I also think this is a very Midwestern quality we should try spreading around the country, of being able to feel differently about politics and not be jerks about it. Right?
So Pete, we're down to less than 5 minutes here, so this is going to be the last question. The other Pete that you have been is candidate for president Pete. And a little birdie said, well, maybe he'll be a candidate again. Obviously, I'm not going to ask you to answer that question, but the question I am going to ask you is, how would you go about evaluating?
It's awfully hypothetical here.
I'm not a professional journalist, which should be obvious. No, but how would you evaluate if you would run for president or not? What kind of factors would you consider?
Let me tell you what I've weighed in the past deciding to run for office.
Fair.
And also deciding not to run for office. It's no secret that I took a hard look at the Senate and gubernatorial races here in Michigan, my adopted state, which, by the way, has been a wonderful place to live ever since we moved here to be close to family. I thought I knew my way around this region. I'm going to sound like Sarah Palin, but I could literally see Michigan from my desk in the mayor's office on a clear day in South Bend. But then again, up north is a little different. We live in Traverse City. That's where Chasten's from. He grew up in a community called Grawn, close to Traverse City. We wanted to make sure we were close to his parents once the twins came on the scene and rearranged everything in our lives. And so we headed there. I thought I knew the lake effect because I've plowed some pretty big snowstorms in my mayor days, but it's different up north. Anyway, all this to say, I've always asked myself two questions. One, what is needed in the office and sometimes in the party in that kind of slot? Whether it's mayor of South Bend, chair of the DNC, which I ran for in 2017 and luckily for me did not win, or even when I ran for president. And then the other thing I look at is, what do I bring to the table? And is it different from the others? So for example, the very improbable decision I made, it's not like when I ran for mayor, I thought, okay, if everything goes really well, then, in my second term, I can go right to the White House, right? That was not any kind of plan. But what happened was I saw that my party was struggling to connect in the industrial Midwest, where I lived, struggling to connect with a newer generation, which I belonged to, struggling to think outside of Washington and be more in tune with great local leadership, and I was a local leader. And for a whole bunch of other kind of unlikely reasons, I began to feel that even with 20 people running, and it was literally 20, if you remember what those debates were like early on, that I brought something to the table that was just different from the others. And some of that is tonal, actually. Sounds superficial, but vibes, as they say, really is a big part of this. There are times when it really seems like what people need, or what a party, at least in its base, needs or expects, is a kind of performative anger. And there are other times where folks want the complete opposite of that. But mostly, of course, it's substantive. And what I'm very interested in right now, and I don't view myself as necessarily the solution or the only solution to this, but twofold. First of all, on at least those issues where we do have a strong consensus among the American people about what to do. And we've got like a 60, 70% consensus on a lot of things to do around taxes and healthcare and even some social issues. Can we at least get that stuff done? But also, I think we need to be much more serious about deep architectural work on our political systems. We keep saying it can't go on like this, but if it can't go on like this, then it won't. And the reality is, Everything from, in my view, the loss of legitimacy on the Supreme Court, to the fact that 1 out of 10 of our US House elections is actually competitive in a 50-50 country. And that's obviously getting worse with this fiesta of redistricting that's gone on mid-decade. We got to look at really deep issues so that everybody's vote counts the same, and so that our representative republic is actually representative. And so right alongside those bread and butter issues and making sure we have lower costs and higher wages and fairer taxes, I will concentrate my efforts on making sure we have a better political system, whether that means running for office or something else.
Ladies and gentlemen, Michigan resident, the Honorable Pete Buttigieg.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Appreciate it. Thanks very much. Thank you. Appreciate it. Great discussion. Not everyone will get it.